Good morning all and welcome. Jesper, stop sneaking away. Come on up here. Come on. This is, Jesper and I often get to present on stage but never together, and often seen at the bar together, and this thing, we hatched this at sort of 3 o'clock this morning that maybe we're both going to need to have some support. So firstly, I'm just going to give you a little bit around some industry consolidation, and then Jasper's going to talk about his usual boring stuff around numbers.
Oh, come on.
And then we're going to bring it all together. Let's talk about the industry consolidation. So that's having recently moved a year and a half ago to JLL. That's what I look after as global head in terms of M&A, and really focused on what's happening in management companies and management platforms. Has it occurred? Yes, it has occurred. The Marriott Starwood deal we've heard lots about, and we'll hear a little bit more about that this morning. H&A and Carlson Residor. Accors then went with Fairmont, significant transaction, and we heard a great session yesterday from Michael Eisenberg and Eric around some of the nuts and bolts of that deal. We've got some regional deals with Jin Jiang, IHG and Kimpton, Marriott. This thing is certainly happening. Why is it happening? This industry that we are so passionate about, and we talk about the big players and we talk about domination from this player and this player. At the end of the day, this is a very, very fragmented industry. So if I take the consumer, some major consumer industries like car, cruises, tobacco, etc., and we look at the level of domination of the 5 biggest players and how they dominate that particular industry on a revenue basis, we can see that on the whole lodging, and this is even after the transactions that I just had on the previous slide, even after that, it's essentially about a 23% position for this industry. So although we often get caught in our own little bubbles, as a global consumer industry, we are fragmented. Now, what has driven those transactions that we spoke about, and a host of others that we haven't put on the slide, and it's these issues, and we want to look at a couple of these in a little bit more detail. Accelerated global growth, leveraging operating efficiencies, cost of distribution, loyalty program, and owning the guest, and owner and franchisee preference. The sorts of things that were occupying the mind of Arne Sorensen when on that Saturday morning he decided to trump Hyatt's bid to buy Starwood. And it was no doubt on the mind of Sebastian Brazin and his A-team when they looked at what were they going to pitch for Fairmont. And it was a big price, which we'll look at later on. These were the issues that were occupying them. What's the result? Let's just look at the Marriott deal. Wow. You now have a whole series of some 30 brands. Marriott Starwood or Marwood isn't going to be selling any of these brands. They're finding a home for all of them in this big hotel here. And they've broken it up into luxury, premium, and select. The purple colours are those colours that they acquired from Starwood. And so you've got both this classic and distinctive, so that's sort of like the hard and softer brands, and then we've got the premium, luxury, and select. So you've seen a great mix of brands that have been able to come together here, and let me tell you, every one of those is finding a home. The other issue around this deal was really Starwood's attempt to get significantly into luxury. And when you listen to Arne Sorensen's comment, the CEO of Marriott, his discussions around what drove him, it's number 1, efficiencies, and number 2 is he needed to own luxury. Why? Because it's high yielding, it adds a luster and a gloss to the brand, it really gives you a position, and he said we've got to own it. Not surprisingly, Marriott then countered with the Fairmont acquisition again, leaping into an acquisition which both gave them a significant North America presence, which has been really a problem for them for 15 years, but also gave them some luxury. Where does that leave Hilton? Where does it leave Hyatt? What are they doing on this? What have we got? 17 Waldorf Astorias, not a lot compared to this. So you can see this is going to be creating a really quite a competitive landscape. The other thing a little bit around this deal is Delta is a Canada, essentially a Canadian property, Canadian management company that's in the premium under classic. And Protea, we know, is the African business. So the idea here is this is not only capturing every type of hotel that you could ever potentially want to stay in, but in just about every geographical location from South Africa to Mongolia. So that's what the global expansion does. Why? It's because this customer is actually right across all of those brands in all sorts of ways. And so the idea is We own it, we own the space, and that's really what's been driving that Starwood deal. The other question is on the efficiencies is the cost of distribution and the power of OTAs, which we hear lots and lots about. Effectively, you've got a duopoly. They worry in the hotel business about this creating some competition issues if a couple of people merge. If you just look at the concentration of power within the Priceline and Expedia group, you can see that this has already occurred, and this is what we have to grapple and deal with. Does scale matter in terms of the commissions? This is this sort of only published data, which is in the USA, showing that those companies that had less than 30 hotels pay about 19.8% in their OTA commissions, whereas the larger chains, even those that more than 30 properties, are 15.9%. Now we know that's just the ability, the buying power of the brand. Now we know that the bigger brands are actually achieving a lot less than that, sort of the pre the merger. So what are we? Depends where you are. It's a little more expensive in the US, a little bit cheaper in Asia, but in the US it's around 12 or 13% that a bigger brand might pay its OTA. Has this had an effect? What was the impact of the Marwood transaction? Well, you won't find too much about it, but let me tell you, it is single digits. So they've gone from 13 or 14 to a number around 8. Now, that's a really significant story in terms of what that means, because if you're out there, what's your OTA business? We know IHG is about 18-19% of OTA. I know everybody's pushing direct, but even the bigger brands have got significant OTA business. David Ray, Wyndham, what would be your overall OTA percentage? 20? Yep. Michael, yours is about 20. Okay. So no matter how you do it, the OTAs are not going away. That's the first point. So the question is, how can I reduce the cost of that channel? If I've got buying power, then hopefully I'll be able to reduce this. Did it have an effect? Yes, Marriott was able to do it. Some of the bigger brands like Hyatt said, oh, it doesn't matter, I'll get the benefit of the discount over time. No, they didn't. So they had a big arm wrestle with Expedia to try and work out a way to get their pricing down. It's all it's confidential as to whatever the deal was, but this is the impact of the pressure. So all of a sudden, if 20% of your business, if the cost of achieving 20% of your business is reduced to a half, where does that money go? Straight to the bottom line. This has a very significant effect on the profitability of hotels. All of a sudden, you've just slashed in half the cost of 20% of your distribution. So that's what's driving it as well. So the question is, if you're bigger, you either buy an OTA, a little bit like Accor's done, or you put yourself in a position where you're able to compete aggressively with it. So that's what's driving consolidation. That makes sense. So the other question about how big they are, if I just look at Expedia and Booking.com being the two largest groups, that gives you an idea of the scale of the properties that they currently have on their websites. And down below is a little bit around what the marketing spend for each of those properties is as well. If I look at IHG, who records that data, about $500 million. And then with Expedia with 3.5 billion. So you can see the volume and power of the marketing spend. It's a little more difficult to talk about the IT spend in these companies because often with management companies it comes in waves as they spend 100 or Accor spent 150, 200 million, Michael, something like that, over about the last 2 years on its IT. And Expedia is going to put a zero behind that in terms of what it's spending. So they're outspending in terms of marketing and they're outspending in terms of IT. So that's what you're competing with. So everybody wakes up every morning and says, oh my God, how am I going to do this? And the issue is bigger is better. Loyalty programs. We heard a bit around yesterday around does it really create a preference in terms of wanting to participate on a particular hotel given the loyalty program, highly focused on for the corporate traveller, but then he exploits and uses his points in a leisure market. Is it relevant? People say it's not relevant. You know, Four Seasons doesn't have one. There's some other groups that haven't had loyalty programs. I think it's a bit clear what happened here with Accor. IHG's got what is allegedly the world's biggest loyalty program, worked very hard to develop it, spent a lot of time and effort, wins lots of awards on it, and have been really driving it aggressively. So what did, look at Accor did. Sort of going, yeah, we're sort of in it maybe a little bit, around 10, 14 million, just a couple of years ago. And all of a sudden, very aggressively through both their own internal growth and then picking up, although it's only a small group, 4 million or so of loyalty members in Fairmont, a very, very important group, and we heard about that yesterday in terms of being able to drive the question of preference with that high-end customer. and then what it did with with the China lodging deal of picking up another 70 million loyalty club members. And where do those loyalty club members go when they travel overseas to try and use their points? Of course, it's going to be in the Accor hotels around the world. So if you think loyalty is not important, well, I think our friends at Accor certainly pitched into it very aggressively. And then you hear Wyndham have just launched their new upgraded loyalty program. And they're not to be outdone. We saw an article yesterday about what Marriott has done with its tie-up with Alibaba. Haven't really got to the bottom of all of that, but the idea is that there's going to be a linkage between Marriott points and the Alibaba loyalty system. So the issue is, yes, loyalty does count, and I think the sorts of decisions made by lots of smart people is that you've got to be in this part of the world. That's don't know what that is. Okay, what do owners think about all this? It's a bit hard to sort of ask owners, what do you think? But one way of looking at it is what's happened to the share price since the relevant transactions have occurred. And I think we can see here what happened to Marriott after the transaction, and this is all indexed back to the date of the decision on the Marriott-Starwood transaction. You can see what's happened with the share price. So the shareholders of Marriott think it's a pretty good idea, and the reason for that is because it's going to drive a much greater unit growth for Marriott, which means that more owners are happy about the transaction, and it's going to drive a greater fee revenue for the particular company itself. So, so on one measure, it looks to be successful. When you go on the street and talk to people about what do you think as a big owner of hotels, what do you think about this Marriott-Starwood connection? If you talk to some of Peter Meyer's old employers at Host and others, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And the owners, some of the owners were saying, oh no, it's terrible because I've got a reduction in choice of this industry consolidation. Then there are other groups that are going, not too sure, let's wait and see, maybe I'll get better service, will it really reflect in a greater return and maybe a lower systems cost for me across the group as a result of the transaction? How's it all going to work out? Interesting, particularly in the US, the position has been that some owners have gone, oh my God, what happens now because I've got in a town like Atlanta where I had 80 Marriott properties and now I've got a Marwood, I've got 160 Marwood properties. How the hell am I going to get lost in that space? Yes, maybe you will get lost. What has happened though is the better positioned properties, the better quality properties have been surging and the lesser properties have not been performing. So what actually this will do is the effect of it will be to actually refresh some of the performance of the assets, that the better assets are going to stay in the system and the weaker assets are going to fall out. So in fact, just enhancing that level of quality. So that's sort of been the impact. There haven't been any wholesale owners saying, I'm out of here. Marriott's, I'm sick and tired. I'm frightened that I'm not going to get overlooked in Marriott. Therefore, I'm going to pack up and walk away. There hasn't really been any wholesale evidence of that at all. So it looks as though the owner franchise performance preference seems to be making sense. So they're the sorts of issues. Now, having said all that, the question then is, if I've got a management company, what's it worth? So there's this massive consolidation going around. Now management companies are enormously attractive. What would my management company be worth? Is the next question that I normally get asked. That's great, Tony, but what does it mean for me? So what it means is that management companies have a value because they now become a target for the sort of aggregation that we were looking at and the consolidation that we were looking at. So what you've got is, what it requires is in terms of the target, you look at it and say, what's got long-term management agreements, what's supported by a robust legal system and enforceable, is there a significant and confirmed pipeline, and is it unique or strategically important? So these are sort of some of the transactions. Luxury brand acquisition by Accor, Fairmont, nearly $3 billion, 43,000 rooms, trailing multiple of around 20 times, and an expectation of forward synergies of about 13 times. That's the impact of synergies and being able to drive that. So 20 times the big multiple. Why? It was a fantastic strategic acquisition by Accor, solved a long-term problem, gave them enhanced their luxury presence with their Sofitel and versions of Sofitel brand, and has really helped reposition the company. So that's a big strategic number. a big number, and but justified by those sorts of things. The strategy, the synergies issue is an interesting issue in terms of the ability for management companies to work with another management company and to create some incredible value there. Maybe a compelling advantage for management companies to buy management companies rather than private equity to buy management companies. Pure management company play at Delta, around a 10 times multiple. Canada, good legal system, long-term management agreements, so it was about a 10 times multiple. If I say that, of 10 times EBITDA. So what is your, quote, your profit? What is the multiple that I'll pay for the company? Around 10 times. Now, Indonesia clearly is not, you know, are there long-term management agreements? What's the position in terms of the legal system? You know, there's some real issues around what is the stickability of those contracts in an environment like Indonesia, and how strategic is it, and what's the state of the pipeline? There's a whole range of issues there in terms of what the EBITDA multiple might be. So what is the multiple of the net profit that I would be paying? Not revenue, but what is the multiple of the profit I'll be paying? And then IHG did a strategic acquisition of Kimpton. Again, you can see some relatively big multiples. So this is not Indonesia in terms of these transactions, and so, but it just gives you an interesting global perspective as to what's happening. So if you've got, Jesper, you've got a management company in your back pocket, go for it. Okay, the transactions themselves, as we scan the globe, there have been a series of transactions that have occurred, not all of them just being straight up and down 100% type transactions. Some of these transactions have been where you've taken a partial interest over time. So there's been a creativity in the sort of form of the investment model that might occur, or the strategy that's being adopted in respect of them. So increasingly, maybe it's not 100% takeover, maybe it involves co-branding, maybe it involves a bit of rebranding. Accor's Rixos acquisition is a 50% interest in a company that actually provides an all-inclusive facility. So Accor, we know, really wants to own accommodation. It owns everything from hostels to Fairmont Raffles. You know, it really wants to own anything to do with accommodation services. It's picked up it's picked up vacation rentals, it's picked up corporate rentals, and Rixos is an all-inclusive opportunity. So let's dive into all-inclusive. Hyatt's been in that business for a while. Marriott's not in it at all, and Isaac going, I'd love to be in, I need to get in that space of all-inclusive as well. Why all-inclusive? Just look at the cruise business. Look at the exponential growth of 20% plus growth in Asia Pacific of the cruise business. It's just an all-inclusive floating hotel. So, so clearly another opportunity. So so there's been, Hyatt wants to move into wellness, so it acquired the Miraval Group. Wyndham wanted to get in South America, a bit light on in South America, so dived in there with a big significant acquisition. Accor has bought the 25 Hours, and we heard a little bit about that funky brand yesterday, acquired a 30% stake, then progressing over time. Banyan Tree picked up a fantastic, both a spa and a resort brand, which resonates all right around the world, has taken a 5% stake, and then has helped in particular ways to help grow that brand. And then Kimpton was a 100% acquisition. So what's happening here is that this is just not a simple 100% acquisition of the company that's generating the consolidation. It's a whole lot of moving parts that need to come together, which accommodate both the interests of the player and really what the target wants to do. And often the target is a management company. It's not like an asset. It's something closer to a family member than a building of bricks and mortar. And so a whole lot of things need to be navigated to achieve those transactions. Okay, what does it mean for Indonesia? Indonesia, like a lot of other places, has got a very significant proportion of the management companies are local and indigenous companies. That's unusual, but for the only other place that would reflect similar to that would probably be Japan. So other than Accor, the major groups have been in here knocking on doors, but haven't really been able to achieve a major presence in a place like Indonesia. What does that mean? Well, you would think in one view that is, let's go to this slide, that is an opportunity for major players to come in. However, John Ford from Archipelago made a point yesterday. Look, I don't need an international brand. It's not important to me. It's irrelevant. I've got a domestic customer base. That's all I do. I look after them, I pay great service, and I make my own money. I don't load it up with a whole bunch of cost. I think we're going to maybe talk about this a bit later, but the issue is if it's an international visitor, then clearly he has an understanding of the value of the brand and he knows that brand from home. He feels safe about it and maybe he'll be able to use his points and maybe he'll be able to get a better deal because of his loyalty program. So of that international visitor, about 40% is the Bali traffic is about 40%. We know it's a lot less in Jakarta, it's about 6 to 8% in Jakarta, but in Bali it's about 40% of time. So if we're looking at particular markets which have high international visitation, then you would be looking at a place like this. Then you look at the market and go, Bali, where is its source markets? So if I'm looking for, Mainland China, who's got a significant presence in Mainland China? Maybe that's a brand that I ought to think about. Who's got a high visibility in Australia? Although you can see from the red dots there, the growth is actually declining out of Australia, accelerating out of China, as we well know, and the other markets. But still, Australia is a very significant source of visitation for international visitors for Bali. So, trying to tie that together. Consolidation happening, global scale, you can see all the good reasons why. It's meaning more money for the operating companies, more money for the owners. It seems to have been embraced. It's feeling threatened by the big ogre of the OTA. How are we going to compete in a space like that? There is a whole lot of other disruptions around Airbnb. In that world, how do we compete? The answer is bigger is better. The flip side of the bigger is better, you've got a gorilla on this side and you've got a quirky little thing over here, because if you're not big and brutal, then you've got to be extremely different, very nimble, and something that doesn't resemble anything like the big gorilla. So that's going to be your point of difference. So it's going to, the market is going to distend between the larger players and then the quirky, unusual small players that know their niche, have a select market. They're not trying to serve everybody who's going from a hostel to a 5-star hotel. They don't want that person. They just not want one little person. He might be in the advertising industry and he loves to go to a hotel in Bondi. That might be just the market you're going to chase for. So that's the other end of the spectrum, or it's the bigger one. So for Indonesia, I think as the market matures, we're going to see a much greater level of consolidation even in this market, potentially where there's followed by corporate and by internationals. Okay, that's a quick summary on consolidation and maybe a touch around where Indonesia sits. What we're going to do is, Jesper's now going to confuse you all, so you can sort of put on your bored faces now and like slump on your hands like that. And he's going to talk all the numbers, and then I'm going to come and talk what the really numbers really mean at the end of this. Right, his name is Jesper Palmqvist. Like, this guy is a rock star. He's bigger than ABBA. He's bigger than ABBA. I've got to tell you. Get ready for it.
Bigger than ABBA. Ready for it. Right. So, this is Tony's bicycle that he takes to the office every day at JLL. Now, basically, we talk about tourism. So travel is growing, and that was the end of Tony's slide, how tourism is growing and travel is growing overall. We'll look at UNWTO and all the numbers. Where are we in this cycle? Well, overall, in the world, there are more positive markets in the last couple of years than there are negative, right? So we know that they're all in different cycles in a way. But if you look just very high level across Asia Pacific, how the supply and demand, if demand is growing with twice the speed of supply, that's a good thing. It means that your occupancy is going up. So that's not bad. We know that overall in Asia Pacific, rates not growing that fast in the last few years, and certainly not so far this year, but it's positive RevPAR and more revenue to the people. Everybody happy, right? So we're still in a positive cycle from that perspective. Now, historically in Asia Pacific, go back 5-6 years, look at that occupancy. So that's a 0% growth. It's really only those little checkered spots that are negative growth. Overall, more people are traveling, more heads in beds, good times. Not so much on the rate. So the rate consistently has negative growth, not by much, but it is hard. And that creates that RevPAR line in the middle, where how the performance is growing. So look what happens when both occupancy and ADR grows at the same time. Things goes really up really quickly. So that's on this high level of Asia Pacific. Let's talk about the ADR more specifically. This is by month to show you the seasonality. First 7 months of this year. See, June is obviously cheaper than January overall. I know it's different in some markets, but overall. So what happened in 2015, if we go back a couple years, it was pretty much the same, apart from a spike in the beginning. We expect the rest of this year to follow that track and go up. But in 2016, it was a little bit lower, right? So it did make a comeback. So rates have this year started to push through. But rates, I mean, it's in a blood red kind of thing, very typical. But rates are very sensitive. speaking of blood, it's kind of like when if you go to the doctor, and well, if you hurt yourself, like I do sometimes, and I have to do knee surgery, and you sit in the hospital for 2 days, what happens? Your muscles disappear in 2 days, and it's going to take 6 months of this in rehab to get them back. It's the same with rates, right? It takes forever. If you drop them, it's going to take a long time to pick them up. And that is a challenge that we continue to see in a number of markets. But we've been helped by this. And this is how the demand has grown. Because you look at the lighter shaded bars there, that's a supply growth that is gently just slowing down a bit towards that 3% mark, whereas demand in the last couple of years has just picked up and growing much faster. So capitalize on that, because if you don't, that will reverse at some stage, especially in certain markets for sure. So we then go into sub-regions, and we start with, Pacific. So that's Australia, New Zealand, and some of the South Islands, but mostly that's Australia. So happy dandy for Tony's country. He's a global citizen, but he's still an Australian. And in Hotels World this winter, a couple of months ago, we talked about, Tony did this session about Melbourne or Sydney, right? Which market is the most favorable one? But I think that ended with both, no?
Sydney.
Sydney, no, so both, right? Because, yeah. So, those are two fantastic markets. And look at the growth in the last few years. That spurs more investment, more interest. Of course, people see that stability in performance and return and everything. Now, does it take longer in a market like Perth? Absolutely. WA and those markets are more dependent on energy and what happened in that sector as well. Brisbane's turned around, Adelaide certainly turned around. So that's different when you look at Central and South Asia, predominantly driven by India, right? You look at India, Sri Lanka and Maldives, but what happened in India is, of course, they started seeing some rate coming back. Yes, it dropped a lot, so it takes time for that to come back up, but we've started seeing secondary, tertiary markets around India where rates have started to come back. So based on 2012, but North and Southeast Asia is such a mixed bag, so we need to move on and look at countries. But there are many cycles. There are many bicycles. So who can guess which country this is? What country is this? Manav? No.
Vietnam.
No. No, you're getting closer though.
Sweden.
No. You're very close.
Sweden.
No.
Denmark.
Yes! Tony wins the prize. I'll give you a prize afterwards.
Right.
This is Denmark, of course, one of the cycle capitals of the world. Never mind. That wasn't really what I was going at. But look at Indonesia, and I will drill down on that in a second. So how it had this growth, and we know there was challenges, and now it's turning back up again, like we're saying. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But comparing that to, say, Malaysia, who had more dramatic negative growth and comeback, we know what happened with the airline incidents and some of the financial challenges that were happening as well, and scandals. But now it's coming back up, especially in the resort markets. You look at the Philippines, who sitting a little bit more slower in the revenue growth, but then now is starting to pick up rate also in Manila across with Boracay and the other destinations. Then we look at Singapore. So Singapore looks very doomy, gloomy, and that's, of course, about the new supply. You've added 8, 9, 10,000 rooms in that small island over the last few years. That does something. Rooms that were arguably needed, absolutely. We're at the tail end of all this addition, right? We got the Yotel opening with 600 plus keys in next month. We got the Andas opening. So there's some really interesting, exciting new product coming. But Singapore is a very volatile market in terms of the rate. They've held their high occupancy, but rates have been struggling. So we expect 2018 this to come back up again, and long term probably make good use of that. But look at Thailand. That's a funny graph. It's a smiley graph, the land of smiles. So Thailand had this 2014, the coup, and everything went down. It was a disaster. Disaster? It hit down to 2012 index levels, and after that, straight back up. The most resilient market in the world, right? Without a doubt. It keeps happening, and they keep coming back, and they reach and they break the high water mark, and they keep going at it. So a fantastic market that many people can study and how to react to adversity and lower demand. Why is people talking about Vietnam so much? That's one reason. There's so much behind Vietnam that we can talk about in a minute, but there's just so much growth happening across the country. So let's cover that in a minute, Tony and I. Because some of the countries I didn't mention, South Korea has had a lot of challenges, and it's not just that they have a man north of the border that is threatening to annihilate humankind on this planet. That doesn't help tourism, does it? But also, South Korea made it a little bit trickier to get group visas from mainland China. They had MERS a couple of years ago. Not good. Combine all that, performance bad, and there's still new hotels being planned. So South Korea, not in a happy place. Talked about Singapore and Thailand. Australia, mixed bag, we mentioned. Japan came from 4 or 5 years of 20, 25% growth, high occupancy, and now rates really high as well. Very short of new supply because it's high construction cost, land is scarce, etc. Now it's more normal growth reaching out. And you know the arrivals numbers that they planned for 2020 was achieved already last year. So now it's 2020, it's 25 million, 30 million. Everyone's going to Japan. The country that was closed for 300 years all of a sudden said, everybody welcome. So it's kind of funny. Indonesia sits there somewhere in between Japan and the Philippines. So again, we look at India. Interesting, of course, in India is as well that the engine is slowing down a bit. We look at the Q2 GDP earnings down below 6%. They wanted to have it over 7%, coming out of demonetization and of course, introduction of GST. Overall, we're still seeing now trickle down to secondary markets that rates are coming back. Not across the board, but some of the major brands are certainly seeing that. Wow, Maldives looks very dramatic. This is a counter reaction of 2 years of more challenging, right? So occupancy is a little bit down, but the rate's up now back again. Remember, Maldives rates are usually, if you've been there on holiday, you probably paid a lot. So, and if you own a property, so it's coming back up again. So it was a change of source markets that changed that, a little bit of length of stay, also some new properties coming. But remember, the Maldives have an interesting 2018 ahead, election year. And also, the government and the association, they want to do these, you know, there's been guest houses in the Maldives. There's been a cheap option for 40 years. But now they want to see, can they reinvent that? Can there be only non-luxury? Can they do something outside that? So it's going to be an interesting year next year. Mainland China is kind of like Australia. Well, China owns, what, 17% of your country physically, I suppose? But it's in the way that it's very diverse. You have big cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen have been growing really well for the past few years because supply slowed down. No more of 15 Ritz-Carlton in the city center, right? So it's more sensible planning on new hotels. Instead, that shifted to smaller markets. You know, the growth of Huazhu, Homin, Plateno, and all those guys, they were having like hundreds of hotels every year. So you had a little bit of an oversupply in the smaller markets, so that's why this growth stays a little bit subdued, but still. So it's more 2 stories to make it very short. But Vietnam, just look at that again, how the occupancy and the rate is growing across the country. And Malaysia, it is coming back. I mean, we're seeing, yes, in KL, you would look at upper upscale and upscale. Is it challenging still from a rate perspective? Sure. But it is starting to come back. But how about New Zealand? They have some of the highest occupancy in all of Asia Pacific. But now you're also seeing that rate, and it's been coming for a few years. New Zealand is absolutely killing it, and they're doing a fantastic job as a very remote nation to attract tourists and everything. And it's a pretty nice place, isn't it?
Yeah, it's lovely.
Tiny
I had a great New Zealand joke.
Yeah?
Someone said I was sitting in Singapore where I live and it was like sweating like crazy. And someone said, oh my God, you're sweating like a New Zealander at a spelling bee. Anyway, we love New Zealanders.
Fish and chips. So let's talk about Indonesia, shall we? Because this looks very dramatic. So the red is the rate and the blue is the occupancy. So what happened there we have to remember before 2012, rates had dropped pretty low, right? Coming out of GFC and everything what happened before the election and everything, rates had dropped pretty low. So dramatically, it came back, but driven by your Jakarta, Surabaya, and Bali, like driven by a lot of those markets, when new demand came, it was a little bit too much pressure, right? The sentiment, and it wasn't as bad as, say, Singapore that dropped a little bit quickly. It was held for a number of months, but it couldn't hold up eventually, and it started dropping. And then we see in 17, it starts coming back, and then we'll see it. So I think for 18, back to Rio's point when you were talking 18, I think we will see some growth. I think we'll see something coming back up. But then 19 again is a very interesting and a different year. And here's one of the main reasons. Look at that hump. That's not what she said. But look at the 8% growth all of a sudden. That's a big difference. So if you used to have 2% supply growth in Indonesia and then you go 8%, clearly something's got to give. Supply is a key factor. And then you look at the demand curve at the end here, that's a lot of Bali, right? People come to Bali all of a sudden when that grows, it helps overall Indonesia numbers look much better. So let's look at regional. So if we start over in Sumatra, so this covers, Sumatra's pretty big, if you didn't know. So it covers a lot of markets in there, like everything from Medan even up to Batam and Bintan, close to Singapore. So the interesting thing about Sumatra is inverted from the rest of Indonesia. That 12% growth last year is very different from overall. Now there are many factors in that, including it's more mid-scale and economy in this data set that we have. and it was less of the supply growth, and it's obviously a counter reaction also to the year before. But it's different. Java is more the overall Indonesian story, right? Challenging a little bit of overall RevPAR growth, and we come back to that because the interesting thing is government trying to make investment outside of Java. So we look at Kalimantan. Pontianak is certainly seeing some of that, and it's come back with 3% this year growth. So that's a nice, interesting market that is growing it. So they want to put investments and more opportunities outside Java, also in Sulawesi. So if you look at the north, where they're clearly helped in a place like Manado, right? Charter flights direct from China helps the market, clearly. But you look at in the south, in Makassar, the challenge there is, of course, there was so much supply, so it's a little bit more challenging, and that creates that mixed, nuanced picture of 1% and down. And then east, for us, it's more of a emerging data set, because it includes these markets like Maluku and Papua. So one or two or three big new properties is going to push that number up really high. So I would manually kind of push that down a little bit. But if you look at a quick recap of some of the key markets, there's the growth this year, and that's all the arrivals and how the great new airport here is pushing a lot of Chinese and other people, and still a lot of Australians, I believe, coming into Bali. Now, from a suburb perspective of Jakarta, this is interesting as well, because first you feel the pressure in the suburbs, and then you feel it a bit in CBD in this case. So more people have coming, but it's been a bit of a rate war if you look at the suburbs of Jakarta there. Bandung has been helped by weekend stays. So people are doing long weekends, pushing that, being helped by the rates there. Jakarta, again, that pressure that we see in Bodetabek. Surabaya, new supply coming, pushing those numbers down a little bit. I'm interested in Yogyakarta particularly, not because it's only a fantastic place to go, but two challenges that I learned from that market is the new guest houses. Right? They're putting additional pressure on the hotels there, so that's something that's interesting as well. What will the traditional hotels do to compete with these new cool, funky guest houses that are coming up? And it's also like Singapore, it's a transit city. It's a transit city. People are going there, but maybe now they stay in Borobudur, not just staying in Yogyakarta. So that is maybe shifting the business a little bit. And Makassar, that's what I talked about, the supply growth challenging them. But they're holding rate, which is encouraging indeed. Comparing a little bit with the Southeast Asian markets, I think the only interesting point is there's only two markets that are over by Tony there that are losing occupancy. So Bangkok and Singapore. But Bangkok are gaining rate, and you see the difference in Vietnam. Look at Hanoi. Right? It started a bit later than Ho Chi Minh, but it's certainly going absolute gangbusters. There's a lot of new supply coming, so we'll see how it reacts over time. But it gives you an idea how your Indonesian cities team up with that. One thing I found interesting when we look at service apartments, a lot of events now and conferences, there's a special track when they talk only about alternative accommodation, they talk about service apartments. So we took 7 first months of this year, and we looked at these markets. So we start with Manila. How did all the hotels, excluding service apartments, perform against service apartments? I can keep clicking through this, and the tendency is this, and I found this really interesting because not everyone, but a lot of people want to get into service apartments. It's a good and sound financial, a business model that everyone at Pan Pacific, Fraser, Oakwood, and Marriott, everyone wants to do more of. But look at a market like Bangkok, which has so much of it. First 7 months, it was hotels performing well, service apartments not in terms of performance. Snapshot in time, perhaps, but something certainly to follow up on. Talking about impact of events, this might be obvious to some people, but it's interesting from a non-Indonesian perspective. What happens during the Ramadan, during the Eid holiday, and post-Eid, so the 28 days after the Eid holiday? Well, clearly, people who are here in Jakarta before and like during the Ramadan and then Eid holiday, what do? Well, they leave. They go to Bandung, Yogyakarta, and Bali. That's where they go. And then after that, they all go back. Oh my God, I got to work again. So they go back. So clearly, there's a really big shift that I wonder if in Indonesia people and hotels really try to address with marketing and be more clever around it, because it's kind of like Chinese New Year in China. And we look at that as well. People are really, it's a mass movement across this great, great nation. And speaking of rock stars, I mean, we look at Pope is another favorite rock star. When he's going around, it affects the market like this, right? And when the good king visited around Asia, because it was a big tour, he brings a bigger entourage than Taylor Swift, right? So what was the ADR impact? Well, if you operate in Bali, if you operate in this particular area, I think you know. Look at the ADR pickup, 30, 23%. In KL, it was, I think, Chris, you said it was 500, 600 people in the entourage, so a little bit smaller, but it's still affected. Whereas in Beijing and Tokyo, that's less of an effect. Now, in different markets overall, but also Tokyo has high occupancy and high ADR. But that is a fantastic effect that creates a blimp in the numbers that we have. What I'm interested in when I look at Jakarta is maturing as a market when I compare it to global cities. Maybe not like New York and London, but other Asian cities. We're starting to see a behavior, CBD versus, so Golden Triangle versus non-CBD, how they are starting to act differently at times. Because historically, it was more like following each other more closely. So you'll see that white line as CBD when some of the luxury properties, I can't take it anymore, I gotta drop my rate, and as a result that happened. But then CBD had already seen a bit of that. We talked about the suburbs earlier, and then they start coming back out. So that's a maturity thing about Jakarta. Bali, I just show you this to see, yes, that's exactly the same graph as you saw earlier with the demand. So everyone coming into Bali, so that's what it is. And the supply growth wasn't as dramatic. But in Bali, if we drill down a bit, over to the left there, over by Tony, you see these markets. That's the arrivals growth picking up, of course, 13%, 8%, doing really well this year. Nusa Dua, yeah, that's King Salman. That is making that bar look fantastic. Now, Ubud, and then we go, hang on, that doesn't make sense. Well, it doesn't. If I strip down and we look at specifically all the properties in the market, we have some that went really well and some that went really bad. So it was more diverse than ever, and that's what affected it. So if you have a property in Ubud that did well, well, congratulations. Some others didn't. Just a couple of final points, and one is on profitability, because I think this number stands out to me, how the departmental expenses for last year was growing by 10%. That's a lot of labor cost, right? So when that increased so rapidly, and you can look at Vietnam and those mega numbers, Vietnam is not normal. Right now, Vietnam is on steroids. It's like Schwarzenegger in 1979, or a Bulgarian heavyweight lifter. So nothing bad about Bulgaria, but so Vietnam is, but you look at the other markets, so that clearly affected your gross operating profit per available room, the GOPAR, that was affected with minus 5% overall in Indonesia. So that's total Indonesia we're looking at. So certainly something. Final point just on the pipeline. There's a lot of hotels being planned, as you know, but what is the pace? So in the ASEAN countries, 36%, so about a third of all properties that are confirmed, so nothing dreamy. So all the confirmed, 36% of them are in construction. So if we look across the markets, Sumatra, 36%, same. Kalimantan is going to be a little bit later, so 25% of the confirmed pipeline is under construction, so a little bit less. But across Sulawesi, the East, and Jawa, something similar. The difference is this. Jakarta and Bali, close to 50%, right? So 43% is already in construction, so that's coming sooner. So if we talked about pressure, there's more pressure coming. And what is it coming in? Compare the last 10 years to 5 years, just like in North America, just like in Europe and in other parts of the world, more about mid-scale and economy. People want more mid-scale brands and want to push them in. So you can wake up now. I'm finished. Tony's point. And here's my summary. There are many cycles. Indonesia rates couldn't be held, but the supply growth, you learned about the 8%. Sumatra is growing stronger than other regions because of how the fundamentals in there. Service departments was kind of challenged in performance. King Salman drove revenue, but also in Bali it was helped by arrivals. Departmental expenses was, that's my Millennium contribution. And then Bali and Jakarta, new rooms are coming a little bit sooner, but we think that 2018 is going to grow to Ria's point as well. So that is it. But
Right. Okay. You did okay, right?
Yes. So we have all right, thank you, sir. So I took a couple of notes earlier when Tony was talking, and we had a couple of things that we found was interesting. And one of the slides was, you were talking about this one. Mm-hmm. So Michael Eisenberg was talking yesterday about how corporate business and how it's come back in. So how do you compete with this if you're coming into the market?
So the question, I suppose, bringing some together, some of the numbers that we've seen and the issues around consolidation and what does it mean for Indonesia is, as I said, we've got a very significant domestic business here of local operators that have grown up in an environment where they've been servicing the domestic traveller and then trying to find that international traveller. And they've been really successful at it. So the question is, given all the other things that are going around, is this likely to change? So if I'm an international operator, what am I going to be focused on if I look at the material that you said? Have you got a clicker there?
Yeah.
So if I go, looks to me, so I've got international visitation. So for those for the global brands who are looking for a greater penetration in Indonesia, clearly this international visitor is going to have your brand is going to resonate a lot better with him than elsewhere. Now, whether or not you look to secure new properties or whether or not you look to consolidate with some of the local brands, matter for you. What area should I be in? Looks to me like I've got to be in mid-scale and economy brands. Yeah.
But so is consolidation likely? Can they do? I mean, in Indonesia, there's a lot of that. You have some big players. You have Accor, you have Archipelago, you have Santik and some other Swiss Bell. But then,
how do you? Yeah. So I think the answer is that the same sort of drivers that the owner of the hotel is sitting there, and he's looking to see whether or not he's going to go with an international or a local brand. These are sort of some of the issues that is going to be confronting him. If I then put myself in the shoes of the operator is then going, I need to be in Indonesia. For all the numbers that we've seen yesterday in terms of the GDP growth, the population, that fantastic shape of what's happening with the age of the population, I've absolutely got to be here. How do I get here? I can try and get in the way that I've been trying before, or will I attempt to consolidate? And so the consolidation question, I'm trying to answer John Flood's very, very, I think quite a profound statement from yesterday, is that you don't need an international brand. And the question is, I think if we've got mid-scale, that's where I'm going to focus. I'm going to chase an international traveller, and then I'm going to look after that corporate market. Because did you see on your other slide about CBD and non-CBD? So what you've got at a maturing in the market of Jakarta, where you have regional properties that are servicing that corporate market. If we bring together Michael Eisenberg's comment that essentially the real driver here is some good leisure, but the growth in the overall Indonesian market is going to be in the corporate business, then maybe that's where it's going to happen. And these are the places, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. And you look at the suburbs we talked earlier, Jakarta, this overflow of business, that certainly those corporate markets in Surabaya is going to continue to grow. And we talk about 10 new Balis, how about 100 new corporate markets?
Yep.
I mean, for me, that's like, the corporate business is not something the government goes in and say like, oh, let's build the corporate market. That's going to happen with the business and the investments that are coming.
And with the increased access of Bandung, with the travel.
Exactly.
And Yogyakarta does surprise me as well because it's such a fantastic location for international visitors. The art scene there is absolutely premier in the world. The number one up-and-coming artist in Australia is actually an Indonesian from Yogyakarta. It is really on the map from a global scale. So anyway, we'll be interested to see.
One thing I was talking about, the OTAs you were talking about earlier. Bring that slide up because the pressure's on this. Now, the benchmark for me is going to be like a brand like 7 Days in China. They have 98% direct business. 98%. I'm not saying 2%. It was founded as a brand that has that, and everyone else is pushing into it. Do you think, I mean, you have these players like Traveloka that is using Expedia and everything, but Indonesia has a lot of entrepreneurs. So, there must be room for Indonesian, even smaller companies to optimize better.
Well, I think Traveloka is an interesting one. Those would have read the paper just last week or so. Expedia has made a significant $300+ million transaction involving Traveloka, which I know a lot of people in the room would use. So that's what these larger groups are doing. They're moving in, picking up the local OTAs. So that's the other business. Set up an OTA.
That's right. Or an Airbnb.
So an Airbnb. So I think your numbers would show, in terms of OTAs, I mean, there is, on the whole, at least a 20% use, even by the major firms. So it's still, whatever we might think about in terms of trying to eliminate OTAs out of your sort of constellation of distribution opportunities, this is, it's still there. So,
on Airbnb.
Okay.
Yeah, just a quick note on Airbnb, because we did this research. You know how people do scraping the websites to see how they're doing? What we did, and we presented it a couple of times, is we got real data from Airbnb. It was the first time they shared it with an outside company. So how do we compare Airbnb data with hotel data? Well, you don't, before you need to strip it out. So we removed like single room and that kind of stuff. So we normalized it as much as we can. We had 13 markets around the world, 12 months of data, and it was like Sydney, it was Tokyo, and a bunch of other markets. And the end summary of that is that, no, they haven't stolen all the share in the world, right? And we know that legislation is picking up finally. A lot of cities and countries are now putting that in and making it possible, taxing, whatever it is, and different measures.
At the same time, possible, but in some occasions restricting it, right? So no
Correct.
more than 90 days a year in Berlin and
either
Amsterdam.
time restricting or money
Yeah.
restricting. You have to pay taxes if you make over $300,000, $30,000. So different ways of doing it. But Airbnb, remember what they said about OTAs in 2002? Oh, they're small, but they're growing really fast. Sounds like Airbnb. So people are using it. But what I'm interested in this reverse engineering fact. When you look at markets today that are very popular for Airbnb, and that's not hard to figure out. You can say, where are people looking at Airbnb? Is there a hotel there? And one example, we looked at east suburb of Sydney, where there are no pipeline hotels planned, but maybe that's an opportunity for a funky boutique brand or something where Airbnb is thriving. So Airbnb is certainly not going away, and something to do with it.
So the idea there is if I'm looking to where to put my new cutting edge 3.5, 4-star,
Exactly.
maybe the Mama Shelter.
Yeah.
I would go and look at, you can get the Airbnb called Airbnb data, DNA data. You can look and see where everybody is and say, okay, that's the sort of customer I'm after.
Yeah.
I'm going to go and
Or
target
that art hotel, the Indonesian brand, Jakarta.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. Same.
Very good. Cool.
So, the overall numbers, Airbnb, all our research has been the same. Some key, 30 key destinations around the world that can represent up to 10% of the business. Overall, it's sort of 2%. And I think the other issue is, two other things. One is that it really comes to play, it surges in high demand markets. So if there's major events on, major sporting events or cultural events, it surges high. People leave town, rent out their apartment to help pay for the next holiday.
Yes.
So that's one. And sorry, I was going to think of something else. I had something incredibly profound to say.
Incredibly profound. It was so grand that we left it outside.
Anyway, we'll run with that.
Yeah, it's okay. Very good. To round off our
what
final
about
point.
this? Yeah.
Yes, I was always interested in talk about the Vietnam a little bit earlier, because we can talk about how the RevPAR number, but it's just how infrastructure, there's new airports, new airlift coming in, visa deregulations, and it's domestic and international brands. It's luxury and economy. It's resort and city. It's across the board. It's crazy.
Yeah.
But from an investment perspective, are people still considered opportunistic if you go into Vietnam? I mean, we're seeing all the brands. Everyone's coming in.
Yeah,
is the fear gone?
I mean, it's literally the major brands that are in the room would be, this is where they're lining up here in terms of chasing these markets. And so if you're a developer with a KPI of X number of rooms, you want to try and get that country as your responsible country.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, you got Vietnam David Ray, have you? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, he's smart. He jumped on the Vietnam bandwagon. Yeah, everybody's there. It is exponential in terms of the growth. The investor market, though, I think if you look at it, those who've been around long enough to know that the Vietnam cycle has gone like up and down like this. We've had all sorts of difficulties with corruption and all sorts of other issues in terms of trying to deal in that market since the 90s. Seems to be coming out up and out of that. From an investor point of view, we heard from Peter Meyer yesterday, 300 mil going into Vietnam with a joint venture with a local group there. So I think that's the sort of thing that happens. There's a surge of interest, the brands lead, and then the money follows.
Fantastic. Should we wrap up before Manav
I think we
kicks us
should.
off stage?
We should.
Yes.
We should.
Right. Well, I hope that gave you something. We didn't leave any time for questions because we didn't want any. I don't know.
No, we didn't want any.
No, it's all right. Yeah, otherwise you can attack us.
Because we know it all.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.